Welcome to our presentation today. The City of North Miami Beach Library is very proud to host Marcia Jo Zerivitz for today's program. Marcia is the founding executive director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. She's a native West Virginian who has lived in Florida for more than a half a century. She's been a trailblazer in the American and Floridian Jewish communities, serving national, state, and local organizations, and has broken the glass ceiling as the first woman in many positions. In 2016, Florida International University awarded her a Doctor of Humane Letters honoris causa for her vision and leadership throughout her life to expand knowledge and enrich collective historic memory. Through her experiences, she observed that the Jewish community in Florida had a major challenge, its continuity, and resolved to focus on collecting and preserving for future generations the stories and material evidence of the contributions of Jews to the Sunshine State and beyond. From 1984 to 1992, Marcia Jo traveled 250,000 miles throughout Florida, conducting grassroots research and retrieving the state's hidden 250-year history of the Jewish people of Florida, resulting in a major archive and the Mosaic Jewish Life in Florida exhibit that traveled to 13 cities from 1990 to 1994. In 1995, under her direction and planning, this project evolved into the AAM-accredited Jewish Museum of Florida on Miami Beach, housed in two adjacent restored former synagogues on the National Register of Historic Places. Marcia Jo initiated the legislation for both Florida Jewish History Month each January and Jewish American Heritage each May to increase awareness of the contributions of Jews to the quality of life for all. Her scholarship has been used in exhibitions, films, historical journals, and books, and she has been published nationally and internationally. Marcia Jo retired from JMOF in 2011 and continues to curate exhibits, lecture, research, and write on Florida Jewish history and anti-Semitism. The author resides on St. Pete Beach with her husband Elliot. Her book, Jews of Florida, Centuries of Stories, was released in 2020 and is the subject of today's program. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Marcia Jo. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be happy to acknowledge them there, but we will not be answering questions during the program. Marcia, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and welcome to the Zoom audience for the North Miami Beach Public Library. Together in the next 65 minutes, we will share compelling stories about Jews in Florida as an example of the acculturation process of every immigrant group. As you know, families of everyone in America and in Florida came from somewhere else in some generation. To celebrate 25 years since the opening of the Jewish Museum of Florida on Miami Beach and 35 years of my collecting and interpreting the material evidence of the Jewish experience in Florida, I wrote a book on what was once a hidden history. Why did I write this book? First, even though Florida is the nation's third largest Jewish community after California and New York, and probably the first place where Jews arrived in what became the United States, no one else had done the research. That was astounding to me. Second, to debunk myths, like the notion that the history started on Miami Beach post-World War II. And in reality, it was probably 348 years prior in St. Augustine, but surely 150 years earlier in Pensacola. And I'm going to talk about all of that. Third, for Jews, it is important to have Jewish memories for Jewish continuity. And fourth, I wrote this book because it is timely. With the rise in anti-Semitism, when Jews are even blamed for the coronavirus, and Camp Auschwitz shirts and Nazi flags and symbols were seen during the January 6th domestic terrorist attack on our capital, it is important to convey that diversity is strength and what Jews have achieved to improve the quality of life for all, even though we are less than 1% of the world's population and less than 2% of the American population. January is Florida Jewish History Month. I work with the Florida legislature that passed the resolution in 2003, making each January a time to learn about and celebrate the contributions of Jews to the development of the Sunshine State. I also work with the school system to develop and distribute a study guide for my book that is now available in all 67 counties for middle and high school students to learn this history. The word history contains the word story. Jews are storytellers. I'm going to tell you a story about how this history was retrieved. Little had been revealed up to 1984 when I got involved in the Mosaic Project to research this history. From where I lived in Orlando, I spent the next 8 years on the road, traveling 250,000 miles from community to community across Florida to set up and manage volunteer task forces for the grassroots research, to collect oral histories, documents, photographs, and artifacts that told the story of Jewish life in Florida. This involved hundreds of people. I did not do this by myself. Florida has 21 million people. That includes about 750,000 Jews, or about 3.4% of the population. Most people think that no one could be a Florida native or surely not have parents and grandparents born in Florida. Jews ask a lot of questions. For nearly 4 decades, I have asked a lot of questions. The answers and material evidence I assembled resulted in a huge story. I get asked, how do you know what you know? Being a product of 1940s, 50s public schools, where I began the research in the 1980s, my inclination was to go to the public library, but there were absolutely no books on this subject. I went to the state archives in Tallahassee, where they had 2,000 different categories. They did not have a category for Jews. Zero, nothing. And this was before Google and Wikipedia, if you can imagine that. So the primary method was oral histories. Dr. Samuel Proctor was born in Jacksonville and taught Florida history at the University of Florida for 50 years. He was the master of oral history. He trained me how to talk to people, what questions to ask, and how to ask, and most importantly, how to listen. During the oral history process, I asked for photos and artifacts that supported the stories I was hearing. I did my best to validate those stories and memories of the people interviewed and make connections of families throughout the state. An important part of the process was to create a database on a 512K map, which is the centerpiece of this photograph, that came out in 1984, resulting in a collections archive that was the basis for creating the Jewish Museum of Florida in 1995. This database was good enough to get the museum accredited by the American Alliance of Museums and continues to be used and expanded. This collection was the source of 85% of the photos for my book. One example, it's 1986, before cell phones, Google, and Wikipedia. And I am in Jacksonville interviewing Rosalie and Robert Coleman about his grandfather, George Delinsky, shown here in the photograph. In 1857, George was the first boy born to a Jewish family that planted roots in the state and has continued to live here as Jews since 1850. I asked if they had any of George's personal possessions, because that's what makes people's lives come alive. Not only the photographs, but to show people's things that they actually handled and had. Rosalie chimes in. I have his pocket watch with Hebrew numerals that he carried his entire life. It's in the safety deposit box at the bank. No one in the family knows that I have it. Would you like to see it? I say absolutely. And at the bank, I asked if our Mosaic Jewish Life in Florida project could borrow it for the traveling exhibition. She says yes. And then in 1995, when we created the Jewish Museum of Florida, I went back to her, as I did to everyone who had loaned us materials for the traveling exhibition, and asked if they would donate it to the permanent collections at the museum. And she said yes. And I want to emphasize that is how we gathered the collection, piece by piece. The family continues to live in Jacksonville and has 75 descendants in Florida into the 8th generation. The research findings resulted in the Mosaic traveling exhibit that opened in Miami at the Historical Museum, which is now called History Miami. It opened in 1990 and then traveled to 13 cities over 4 years. The success of this exhibit and the enthusiasm and press it generated throughout the state and actually the whole nation was the impetus to create the Jewish Museum. I was designated executive director in charge with finding a place in 1992. I found these buildings on South Beach in a deteriorated state. The one on the right was about to be torn down. They were the synagogues for the first Jewish congregation on Miami Beach beginning in 1929. Until that time, Jews were not allowed to have a synagogue on the beach. They had to go over to Miami, where there had been a congregation since 1912. They had to go over by boat. This was before there were any bridges. So I raised the money to restore and adapt these buildings. In 1995, Mosaic evolved into the Jewish Museum of Florida. We were no longer wandering Jews. We had a permanent home for the collections and a place to present exhibits and public programs, to tell the stories of one ethnic group in a hugely diverse state. 2020 was our 25th anniversary. Now for some samples of my stories. From my work with Mosaic, I became a Florida history and news junkie, and making the Jewish connection to those stories as I found them. This morning, like every morning, I read the Washington Post on my phone. Since 2013, Marty Barron has been executive editor, a position he formerly held at the Miami Herald. In 1954, he was born in Tampa, where he grew up. His parents had relocated from Israel and had every news resource available in the home to learn about their new country. That's how he got interested in journalism. Barron's role as editor of the Boston Globe was highlighted in the movie Spotlight, which I'm sure a lot of you saw. He led the investigation in 2003 into the cover-up of sexual abuse by priests within the Boston Archdiocese. I watched the CNN News. Five-time Emmy Award winner Jeff Zucker has been president of CNN since 2013. He was born and raised in Miami. His parents, Arlene and Matthew, still live there. In fact, I got this photo from his mother, which is where I got a lot of my photos from the families. I checked in on my family on Facebook. Isn't that how we track our children and grandchildren today? Since 2008, Sheryl Sandberg has been #2 at Facebook, the world's largest social network. She grew up in North Miami Beach and maintains a circle of women friends from middle and high school there. It is significant to note that in November 2020, Facebook committed to banning posts that promote anti-Semitism, including posts about Jews controlling the world and posts denying or distorting the Holocaust, which is anti-Semitism. I put on my Spanx bra as I dressed. Founder Sara Blakely was born and raised in Clearwater and attended Florida State University. In 2000, Oprah Winfrey named Spanx her favorite product, and sales took off, reaching $1 million in its first year and $10 million in its second year. Forbes touted her as the youngest self-made billionaire in the entire world in 2012. Spanx is now available in 50 countries. I checked the cash in my wallet that included a $100 bill with Robert Rubin's signature. Rubin was sworn in as the 70th U.S. Secretary of the Treasury in 1995 and served for 4 years. As a fourth grader, Rubin moved with his family from New York to Miami Beach. He graduated from Miami Beach High School in 1956 and went on to become a lawyer, banker, and economist. Journalists say they would rather tell the story than be the story. One of the most tragic stories is of dual American-Israeli citizen and journalist Steven Sotloff, shown here in the center in his helmet. He was born and raised in Miami, a grandson of Holocaust survivors. A University of Central Florida graduate in journalism, he studied Hebrew and Arabic in Israel and Yemen so he could tell human interest stories about the Middle East. It took me a very long time to find this photo that showed what he did. Look at the paper and pencil in his hand and the intensity on his face. You likely remember the story from October the 7th in 2020 that the US brought 2 ISIS militants to Virginia for a federal trial because he was beheaded by ISIS on international television in 2014 in Syria. They were finally able to capture 2 of the militants that had kidnapped, tortured, and murdered Sotloff and 3 other Americans. While I was writing the book, items appeared in the national news that directly related to Jews in Florida. Ivor Schamis taught a Holocaust class for 17 years at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. On February the 14th, 2018, Ivy said that in class they were discussing hate groups likely to be on their college campuses and tactics to stand up for what is right. At that moment, loud shots rang out in the hall, and the students flew out of their seats and tried to shield themselves, some using Ivy's vast collection of Holocaust books. The shooter appeared at the glass panel in the door, killed 2 students, and injured 4 in that classroom in front of Schamis and her class. 5 of the total 17 dead that day were Jewish. Schamis asked, how can this happen in, of all places, a classroom where students were learning how to combat hate? The lessons of the Holocaust were coming alive right there in room 1214. Florida Jews have made news with their contributions to the arts. Last year, Michael Tilson Thomas was among the 42nd annual Kennedy Center Honors in Washington. It was big news in the entertainment industry when Jerry Herman died in December of 2019 on Miami Beach, where he had lived. Known for his work in Broadway musical theater, Herman composed the scores for Milk and Honey, which is about Israel, Hello, Dolly, Mame, La Cage aux Folles, and many others you would know. Many of his show tunes have become pop standards. He graduated from the University of Miami in 1953, where the Jerry Herman Ring Theater is today. He won 2 Tony Awards in their Lifetime Achievement in 2010 and was a Kennedy Center honoree also. Just last week, there was an article in the New York Times about a big online tribute show. Perhaps many of you have seen it. It's been very well publicized. I showed the article. It was just last Friday that was in the New York Times. If time permitted, I could go on and on about Florida connections to national and international happenings. The connections range from the 1500s to today. So when did Florida Jewish history begin? Most are not aware that Jews could not live in Florida for 250 years after Florida was discovered in 1513. That is when Ponce de Leon first reached the Florida coast, probably between today's Daytona Beach and Melbourne, found the natives hostile, and named the land La Florida after Pascua, Florida, which means the Feast of Flowers, because it was Easter time. Because this was during the Inquisition, which lasted from 1478 to 1834, and Ponce de Leon sailed for Spain, which then owned Florida, only Catholics could live here for the next 250 years, until 1763. That is when the Treaty of Paris was signed in Paris, France, following the French and Indian War, the final phase of the century-long Anglo-French struggle for colonial and commercial supremacy. In this treaty, Spain ceded Florida to Britain, and people other than Catholics could finally settle, including Jews. These 1765 Pensacola Council minutes reflect the names of the 3 Jews who had arrived in 1763. Alexander Solomons, Joseph de Palacios, and Samuel Israel bought property and stores and did business with the British and others, selling wood and dry goods. American Jewish history, we are told, begins when the first Jews arrived in America in 1654 in New Amsterdam, which became New York, after sailing from Recife, Brazil, to escape the Inquisition there. In the early 1980s, when I began research, it was my hypothesis that it was very possible that American Jewish history started in Florida in 1565 in St. Augustine with conversos. Historians note that there are Spanish Jewish names on lists of soldiers and settlers in St. Augustine in 1565. Even with continuing pleas, I kept hitting walls when trying to engage serious scholarly study on this subject. Finally, Rabbi Merrill Shapiro, who had been a friend of mine when I lived in Orlando, he heard me and responded by organizing the St. Augustine Jewish Historical Society and digging in to unearth some very interesting facts. In my book is the first publication of their findings. You'll see, for example, that the name of the Jewish harbor pilot in St. Augustine in 1577. Florida is often overlooked when writing American Jewish history. We can now say that the history between 1492 and 1654 needs to be rewritten to include this chapter in Florida in the 16th century. We do know that 200 years ago, 26 years before Florida's 1845 statehood, One Jew took advantage of the development opportunities. No photo exists of Levy, only this house drawing created by Chris Monaco based on Levy's writings. In 1820, a year before Florida became a U.S. territory, Moroccan-born Moses Levy began purchasing 100,000 acres, a span that spread from Gainesville south to Sanford and west to Tampa Bay. Levy formed the Florida Association, the first development corporation in Florida. He was the first developer in Florida, a Jew. Who knew? His attorney was Alexander Hamilton Jr., who at that time was U.S. Attorney for East Florida. Moses Levy, the most important person in early Florida Jewish history, built his 1,000-acre Pilgrimage plantation just south of Gainesville. Pilgrimage was a fully functioning plantation that lasted from 1822 to 1835. Its main commodity was sugarcane, which Levy had reintroduced to Florida. It was intended as a refuge for oppressed European Jews to become farmers in a communitarian settlement, the first on U.S. soil. Felix Warburg of the famous German banking family was his recruiting agent in Europe. At least 5 German Jewish families lived here, including Warburg. If any of you went to the University of Florida, you know there's a Lake Warburg on the campus, and that is named for Felix Warburg. Moses Levy was Florida's first education commissioner, so important, an advocate of public schools, and instrumental in establishing Florida's first free public school in St. Augustine. Even in a slave economy, he was also a vigorous advocate for the gradual abolition of slavery and the humane treatment of enslaved people. Moses Levy was the father of David Levy Yulee, the first U.S. Senator from Florida and the first Jewish U.S. Senator in American history. There have only been 2 Jewish senators from Florida, the first Yulee, and the second was Richard Stone, who served from 1975 to 1980. David moved to Pilgrimage at the age of 17 and lived there for 4 years, helping his father, Moses Levy, run the operation. Then he apprenticed to become a lawyer. In those days, there were no law schools. You had to apprentice with another lawyer. So he went to Tallahassee, and then he was admitted in 1836 to the bar and got involved in politics. When Florida became the 27th state in 1845 with the leadership of David Levy Yulee. He helped draft Florida's Constitution and worked hard for statehood when there were about 60,000 people in Florida that included about 100 Jews. He faced anti-Semitism in the U.S. Senate. Vice President John Quincy Adams referred to him as that alien Jew delegate from Florida, even though he had gone through citizenship proceedings twice. Yulee was the family's ancestral name in Morocco, a name he added to Levy when he went to Washington. David Levy Yulee was important both in politics and the economy because in 1861, he formed the Florida Railroad Company, which was the first cross-state rail system that went from Fernandina on the East Coast to Cedar Key on the West Coast. For the first time, goods arriving from Europe could be shipped directly across the state instead of going by boat all the way around the tip of Florida. The railroad operated for 80 years. In my book, you will find a defense about his conversion, which some people say. The evidence is that he died a Jew. During World War II, there was a U.S. Liberty ship named for him. Moses Levy's plantation was destroyed at the start of the Second Seminole War in 1835. And this is when I introduce another important person in Florida history, Abraham Myers, for whom the city of Fort Myers is named on Florida's west coast. This Florida map tells a huge story. It reflects the sequence of the earliest documentation I could find of Jewish life in communities around the state. I included photos of pioneers in each place. So I've already spoken about Pensacola in your top left, which was first settled by Jews in 1863. Then we go to Micanopy in 1819, which is where Moses Levy was actually a founder of Micanopy and started his plantation. Tallahassee is number 3 in 1837. It had become the state capital in 1824. And then we have both Jacksonville and Key West about the same time in the early 1840s because they were ports of immigration. If you've ever been to the Ellis Island Museum in New York, you'll probably remember a large map of immigration on the wall. And on that map, you'll see the ports of Jacksonville and Key West. And then Tampa, the first Jew there was in 1844. 48 years before there's a South Florida. You notice I have not mentioned South Florida yet. There was no South Florida. Ocala was the 1850s, Orlando 1865, Palm Beach and Miami both 1892. And those were both in anticipation of Henry Flagler's railroad, which came down the East Coast. Henry Plant had a railroad down the West Coast. Henry Flagler had a railroad down the East Coast. And that is what opened up South Florida. He got to West Palm Beach in 1894 and then to Miami in 1896. And then we have St. Petersburg, where I live, in 1901. And then Broward County. The first Jew was in Broward County and actually in Davie in 1910. And then both Sarasota and Miami Beach come in 1913. Fort Lauderdale in 1915. And this was the most surprising to me. Boca Raton, which today has the state's largest Jewish population, was the last place, not till 1931, was there a Jewish family in Boca. The first Jews in Boca were Harry and Florence Brown. They were immigrants from Russia with the name of Bugalowski. They opened Brown's Sundries on Federal Highway, which later became a diner. As I said, Boca was the last place to develop a Jewish community. Boca Raton was founded in 1924, and this family were the only known Jews there until after World War II. The Boca Historical Society records that by 2015, 50% of the population was Jewish. The Moses Levy family is no longer Jewish. So I always get asked, who is the longest continuing Jewish family? The answer, the Delinsky family, who came to Florida by 1850, which connects back to the watch I showed you in the earlier part of my presentation. Philip Delinsky in the top left was the first to arrive in Jacksonville. He brought his father. The mother had died in the crossing Atlantic with the family, so that he brought his father and 8 siblings, 8 brothers and sisters. Philip married a Jewish woman, Ida Ehrlich. Their children were born in Jacksonville. George, who you saw as an older man, here he is, a young boy sitting on the chair, born in 1857. And then his sister Regina was born 2 years later in 1859. On the top right, you'll see a photograph of Morris Delinsky. He was the mayor of Jacksonville and the first president of Ahavat Chesed, the synagogue there, which was the second Jewish congregation in Florida. The first I'm going to show you in a little while. The lower right is their sister Helena. Helena married Robert Williams in Tallahassee. He was a Jewish businessman and a cotton plantation owner. Yes, Jews were into cotton. They had 5 daughters and they all married Jews. This was truly remarkable, with so few Jews in Florida in the mid-19th century and a statement of their adherence to Jewish tradition. This is an 1897 photo of their family in front of their home in Tallahassee. In the early days of my research, I found that Helena and Robert Williams' first daughter, Rachel, remember I said they had 5 daughters, well, the first one was the first Jewish child born in this family, which I always thought that George was, but George was born in 1857. He was the first boy. She was the first child born in 1856. And the most frustrating thing for me, as you can tell by now, that I tell my story through photographs and through artifacts, and no one in this large family had a picture of Rachel. And this was most frustrating to me. And it wasn't until December of 2018 that I finally got this photo that I had been seeking for 35 years. That was truly a jubilant day. In spite of not being wanted, Jews have hugely contributed to the history and development of the Sunshine State. Another daughter of Helena and Robert was Mina Williams, a 3rd-generation Floridian Jew by 1885, when she was the first Miss Florida. Another major pioneer Jewish family, active in business as well as civic and religious life. And this is what impressed me. These families didn't just come here and open businesses. They got involved civically and and as well as in their religious life. And these are the Benjamins. Born in Prussia, Simon Benjamin, shown here, immigrated to Florida in 1865. Actually, a member of my family, my daughter-in-law is a member of this family. He came to Alachua County to establish a business in the village of Waldo. And he stayed in Waldo for 3 years until he was literally chased out of town by the Ku Klux Klan. And he moved to Ocala, where some family members had already settled. There, the family opened the first known ice making factory in Florida. Imagine, this is a time when there were no refrigerators in which to store and preserve meat or electricity to operate them if they had existed. Many homes contained ice boxes, and the Benjamins delivered ice on wagons. I just love this photograph because you can see the railroad track coming right up to the ice factory, and you can see the stack of ice there right next to the track getting ready to be loaded. In 1880, both Simon and his brother Solomon were president of in the 1880s, they were both president of the Marion County Board of County Commissioners. And then Simon was on the school board where he started immunizations. He also served as president of the congregation in Ocala. And again, I want to emphasize these are just some examples. The Delinsky and the Benjamin family are just a few examples of these early families that played prominent roles. Simon moved into Jacksonville in 1901. He's shown there in the center of the photograph, and began a cigar and tobacco business and served as president of a congregation there. Again, he served the congregation that Morris Delinsky had started in 1882. His son, Roy Benjamin, is shown here in the back with a circle. He became an architect who was acclaimed for theaters. He designed more than 200 movie theaters, one in nearly every Florida town, including in 1934, the Art Deco classic Colony Theater on Lincoln Road on Miami Beach. The stories go on, and they are so much fun. Meet Saul Snyder, cattleman in St. Augustine. In 1904, after serving in the Russian army, he left and was sent by the Jewish Agricultural Society to Fernandina Beach. Then in 1908, he settled in St. Augustine because he made the 10th man for the Minion. He first had a small grocery store, then he bought a cow, and then he developed a cattle ranch, and eventually was a founder of the Florida Cattlemen's Association in the 1950s, when cattle was the state's largest industry. His cattle brand was the Mogan David, which in Hebrew means Shield of David and refers to the six-pointed star. And his ranch was named Bar Mitzvah. Florida Jews have from the beginning made a living in retail and wholesale goods, first as peddlers. Then the peddlers transitioned into mom and pop stores around 130 years ago. This is the Canner family from Hush, Romania. 8 siblings went to 8 different Florida towns in the 1880s so they would not compete with each other. I just love that. This is the family in Orlando in 1905 and their store, so typical of the early dry goods stores of the immigrants, always very neatly stacked inventory. The 5th generation of this family lives in Miami today. Then there were large department stores opened by Florida Jews. Abe and Ben Amaz came from Germany to Tampa in 1894. This is their photograph of their family. Then brothers joined them. The first Maz Brothers store was in 1896. It became a chain of 39 stores that lasted 105 years and is now incorporated into the Macy's chain. Samuel and Morris Cohen arrived from Ireland in 1867 when Jacksonville was still under military occupation from the Civil War, and established a modest Cohen Brothers store where they instituted fixed pricing rather than the typical bargaining. Then in 1912, they built this mammoth department store occupying a city block. It was the largest structure in the city, and at one time was the 9th largest department store in the United States. In business for 120 years, the building is now Jacksonville's City Hall. And then Florida Jews developed shopping centers like University Town Center in Sarasota, developed by Nathan Benderson, one of the nation's newest shopping malls and recognized as one of the most ambitious retail projects of its kind in the United States. And Aventura Mall in Miami owned by the Sofer family, Florida's largest mall and the nation's second largest, with more than 3 million square feet. And I want to note here that one of the earliest shopping centers in the whole United States was in your community of North Miami Beach, the Samuel Friedman Shopping Center that opened in the 50s and had about 350,000 square feet. And talk about largest. Auschwitz survivor Tibor Hollow arrived in New York in 1945 with $18. You've heard these stories about Holocaust survivors. In 2018, he opened the tallest building in Florida at 868 feet and 85 stories in Miami, with a 2,000 car parking garage at a cost of $800 million. We think that's really big, right? And then consider New York's 28-acre, 25 plus billion dollar project, the Hudson Yards, as the press calls it, a nation state for the 1%, brought to you by the most powerful city shaper in modern times. Stephen Ross graduated from Miami Beach High School in 1958, attended the University of Florida, and became the founding chair of the Related Companies. Ross is shown here standing on the highest outdoor observation deck in the Western Hemisphere at his Hudson Yards. Ross also owns the Miami Dolphin football team, which was the first professional team in Florida. And like many of you, I follow all of Florida's sports teams, many owned by Jews. In Miami, there is the Heat basketball, owned by Mickey Arison, and Marlins baseball, which Jeffrey Loria sold to Bruce Sherman of Naples, and Alan Cohen once owned the Panthers ice hockey team. Where I live in Tampa Bay, all three professional sports teams are owned by Jews: football, baseball, and ice hockey. All three went to their national playoffs this year. The Lightning won the Stanley Cup for the National Hockey League, and the Bucks with Tom Brady are going to the Super Bowl on February the 7th, the first team to play the Super Bowl in their home stadium in Tampa. When I read about trips to and from the International Space Station, I recall that Harry Kaplan of Melbourne helped develop the spacesuit the astronauts wore. Until last May, when SpaceX did a launch, they created their own new spacesuits. Many Jews were involved in leadership positions at Cape Canaveral and the Martin Company. And that the fresh veggies the astronauts eat in space were developed by Betty and Ed Rosenthal of Sarasota, founders of Floricon Fertilizer Corporation, selected as a collaborator with NASA. Look at Betty's feet in the red circle to appreciate the proportion of the size of the red romaine lettuce, which covers her entire body. I found this absolutely amazing. Using the Rosenthal's controlled release fertilizer, this humongous lettuce was the first crop grown in space in just 3 weeks from seed using the fertilizer, and it was consumed, the first crop to be consumed by the astronauts. I want to emphasize that Jews have been notable in agriculture in Florida. When immigrants came from Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, they mostly had come from places where Jews could not own land or be farmers. So working the land was an attractive way to be independent to support their families. Tobacco and cigars are a large part of the Florida Jewish stories. Jews grew tobacco in North Florida beginning in the late 19th century. Most cigar factories were in Key West in the 1880s and then moved to Ybor City in 1891. This factory and label belonged to the oldest family-owned cigar maker in the United States, now into the 4th generation, and is the last cigar factory in Tampa today that had 150 cigar factories, many owned by Jews. Note the Cuesta Rey cigar label with the Mogen David around this is the grandmother of the family, the Mogen David around her neck. The brand is sold in 80 countries today. I shop at Publix where I buy strawberries that until 2011 had this label with the Mogen David, attracting anti-Semitic threats. Polish immigrants Jetta and Harish Wisnacki came to Plant City in 1930. The 3rd generation running the operation today changed the label to Wish. The earliest citrus king was Dr. Philip Phillips in the Orlando area. In 1897, he was the first known Jew to permanently settle there. By the early 1920s, he had developed 5,000 acres stretching across 9 central Florida counties. This made Phillips the largest individual citrus grower in the entire world. He was responsible for key innovations in the processing and packaging of orange juice. He sold to Minute Maid in 1954 and formed a foundation that supports many medical, cultural, and educational facilities in Central Florida. The collage in the lower right, that whole big grouping, reflects places named to honor his generosity in the Orlando area, including the Dr. Phillips Performing Arts Center in the lower right. He was inducted into the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame in 1986. Brothers Jules and Jack Freeman settled in Florida in 1953 with $10,000 and developed the largest orange grove in the world at that time. 4 million trees, 37 square miles. And if you figure the 640 acres to a square mile, that's about 24,000 acres. It was in Arcadia, which is along State Road 70. They accumulated, developed, and sold a total of 89,000 acres, or 139 square miles, which is 6 times the size of Manhattan. I had to go over those figures over and over, but that's fact. Manhattan is about 23 square miles. Driving on I-75 on Florida's west coast, you pass 2 cities developed by Jews. In 1955, Jules and Jack Freeman built San Carlos Park south of Fort Myers. Today, there are 25,000 residents. And nearby, also in Lee County, is Cape Coral, a 114 square mile city developed by Leonard and Julius Rosen in the 1950s also. Today, with a population of 150,000, it ranks behind Jacksonville as the state's second largest city in area. It includes 35,000 waterfront homes, making it among the largest municipal-sized developments in the entire United States. In the area of construction, just look at this view of Miami Beach hotels with the Eden Rock and the Fontainebleau in the foreground, and realize that those two and so many others were built by Jews, including the architecture, construction, and preservation of Art Deco hotels. Russell Galbut and his family have made major impacts throughout the state since his grandparents settled on Miami Beach in 1926. Al and Bessie had a restaurant on South Beach, just a block from the museum, and had 3 children there, Paul, Hyman, and Miriam. This 1954 photograph in the top left is of grandmother Bessie, shown in the back row, with son Hyman sitting with his family. Hyman was a World War II U.S. Navy captain and a Miami Beach City Council member, and he also married a Bessie. They are shown here with their children, left to right, Robert, Abraham, Russell, and David. The 3rd generation became professionals and developers, as in Crescent Heights, the nation's leading urban real estate firm. Now into the 6th generation, the family has more than 100 Galbuts living in Florida. Jews have developed cities and towns all over Florida, and we have causeways and bridges named for Jews who have contributed much to the development of the state. Some examples in your area are the Norman Giller Bridge, the William Singer Expressway, and the William Layman and Broad Causeways. I am asked, why is there a photo of a cruise ship on my cover? They are major economic drivers for our state, bringing in more than $8 billion annually in normal years pre-COVID. Florida is the nation's #1 cruise state, often referred to as the cruise capital of the world. Today, there are 3 major public cruise lines, and all 3 are chaired by Floridian Jews. Nikki Arison at Carnival, Richard Fain at Royal Caribbean, and Russell Galbut at Norwegian. It is acknowledged that maintaining Jewish traditions has been vital in sustaining our heritage for over 4,000 years. Jewish communal organizations are formed to perpetuate Jewish life, culture, and traditions to help ensure Jewish continuity. Florida's first Jewish organization was the 1857 Jacksonville Cemetery, founded after 6 members of the Delinsky family died during a yellow fever epidemic. Until that time, bodies had been shipped out of state for Jewish burial. Then came congregations that built synagogues. This was the first, Bethel, and Pensacola in 1876. By 1900, there were 6 Jewish congregations in Florida, and they all remain in existence. The first congregation in Miami-Dade County was Beth David in 1912. This is a wonderful story I was told by Charlotte Winkle in Sarasota when I was speaking there in the 1980s. What would happen is, as I was starting my research and gathering photographs, I put together a slide presentation. Remember slides before the digital age? And I would schlep my big, heavy slide projector from community to community and get an engagement wherever I could to present what I had been finding and to appeal for more stories and more photographs. Well, after my presentation in Sarasota in the 1980s, a woman at the age of 94 comes up to me and tells me this story about her father, Marcus Winkle, shown here in the top left, which was from 100 years ago from when she's telling me the story. Marcus had gotten his papers to serve in the Tsar's army in Russia, and that was the most dreaded thing for Jewish boys because they would, to take out the anti-Semitic policies of the Tsar, they would be sent out to the most remote places and given the harshest duties, and they rarely survived. So the family told the authorities that Marcus had suddenly died of a high fever, which was not unusual in that time, and they actually buried him alive. And I always get asked, how did he breathe? Well, obviously they buried him very loosely when poked holes in the soil. And soon after the funeral, his family, his friends who were standing around with the family, dug him out. And he picked up clothing that his mother had made for him. And this is his pants that he actually wore out of Russia. They were made from a potato sack. They had left money and they had left this Torah. It was a very Zionistic family. They had already bought land in Palestine. This was 1897. And they had money in the banks in Jaffa. So the plan was, and was well executed, that Marcus would make his way by foot out of Russia through Turkey and get on a boat in Turkey to sail to Palestine, which he did. And he was in Palestine for several years, and he became a sheep herder, and he was living off mostly the family money in the bank. Well, the Arabs kept stealing his sheep, and then the bank failed in Jaffa. So he had no choice but to leave, and he had heard that the only place that was safe for Jews was America. And he had heard of a place called Florida, specifically a place called Moffett, Florida. So like I tell the kids, he couldn't text his family. He couldn't send them an email. He couldn't even telegraph them. He had to physically go back to Russia, the same route which he came, all the time carrying this Torah. And he went back to Russia, told his family that he was coming to America and for the family to join him, which they did in subsequent years. So he came to America and he settled in Moffett, Florida, which is east of Sarasota, and he started a lumber mill. But he was very lonely. So he went to New York and was a match made with Hannah Retkowski, shown in this photograph, was the daughter of a founder of Yeshiva University. So she was a very religious young lady, and he brings her to Moffett, Florida, where there are no other Jews. And they had 2 children, Abe, shown in this picture, and Charlotte, the little girl, is the one who's telling me this story. And she tells me that one day, Hannah stepped on a rusty nail in the lumberyard, and the mill hands, just trying to be helpful, grabbed a piece of salt pork because the salt in the pork would draw out any infection in her foot. But she was so upset that and pork could not touch any part of her body that she finally was successful in her appeal to Marcus to please move to Jacksonville, where, quote, all the Jews lived in Florida. And it was the largest Jewish community in Florida until the 1930s. And then she told me that the Torah was in one of the synagogues in Jacksonville. She didn't know which one. So I went to all the congregations there, and the rabbis were very helpful. And I finally found the Torah in the Jacksonville Jewish Center, which is a conservative congregation. And this is how it's displayed at the Jewish Museum of Florida. Another example of passing on Jewish traditions is observing Jewish holidays. Beginning in 1880, Purim balls were held in pioneer Jewish communities in Tallahassee, Pensacola, Key West, and Jacksonville. This is a photograph of Fannie Moss in 1918, where she had spent months collecting all these seashells to make this fabulous outfit that she's so proud to be a Floridian Jew for her Purim party. In the top of this photo, and this was a photo also from the cover of my book, is a photo of a couple on an alligator. Now, I just found it so interesting, and I found so many pictures of people on alligators. There were baby pictures, there were mayors, business people, and in this case, a wedding photo taking on an alligator, which of course is a symbol of Florida. They were founders of Temple Israel, the first Jewish congregation in Palm Beach, where David owned a florist shop on Worth Avenue. Gertrude was the daughter of Rosa Benjamin and Jacob Katz, shown in these wonderful wedding photos. And this is an article from their wedding in Micanopy in 1886. It's written in this wonderful, flowery Victorian style. And obviously, it was a big deal in Micanopy in 1886 because this was the front page of the paper, the Micanopy Gazette. It was probably the first Jewish wedding in Micanopy. And here, speaking of flowery Victorian language, another article on your left in 1883 from a bris, a Jewish circumcision ceremony of a Jewish male. It was written in 1883. It was from the Sanford paper, the Sanford Journal, and it indicates that the rabbi was brought by boat to Sanford from Jacksonville. That means he would have come up the St. Johns River. And then the article on the right is the first bris ceremony in Miami, which was in 1907. And it also mentions that the rabbi came by boat, this time from Key West. In Miami, this was such a major event that the courts closed. The father of the baby from this bris was Isidore Cohen, the first permanent Jewish settler in Miami when Miami was founded in 1896. And as I mentioned, as Flagler brought his railroad down the East Coast, Russian Jews, some Russian Jews, for example, which Isidore Cohen was a Russian Jew, had first come to New York. And then as they heard about South Florida opening up, they first went to West Palm Beach and opened stores. And then when it was extended to Miami, many of them went further south to Miami. I always get asked who were the first Jews on Miami Beach. In spite of restrictive codes in land deeds that prevented Jews from living north of 5th Street, this Jewish family came from New York City to Miami Beach in 1913, settled at the tip of the beach, and was very successful. Hungarians Joe and Jenny Weiss arrived with their young son Jesse because Jesse had asthma. That was a reason for many Floridians, not just Jews, but many people who settled in Florida came because their doctors said, go to the ocean in Florida, which translated at that time to Miami Beach. It was not even a city yet. Miami Beach was not incorporated as a city until 1915. But Joe's Stone Crab, which was their family business, has been in the same location since 1918 when they bought this bungalow. The same family owns and runs the restaurant. I'm sure many of you have heard of Joe's or been to Joe's. It was the first restaurant on Miami Beach and arguably the most famous restaurant in Florida. And I understand that today, well, also pre-COVID, had the third highest gross revenue of any restaurant in the country. I devote 13 pages of my book to Jews in politics. You will find the volumes of names astounding on the list of federal and state legislators and mayors. Jacob Cohen had a store in Orlando in 1873 and got politically active to help form the city government, serving as the secretary for the organizing town council. These were his minutes in his beautiful penmanship. Most of the people who came from Europe had beautiful penmanships, even though they didn't know English at the time. And he was elected as an alderman. Several years later, he married Rachel Williams, the one that I had such a long time finding the photograph. Well, as I said earlier, it was amazing to me that Jews found other Jews to marry. She was living in Tallahassee. He was living in Orlando. And so they got married and he moved to Tallahassee where he again got involved in politics. The first Jewish mayor of more than 200 that I have identified was Henry Brash, elected in 1879 in Mariana, where he served 3 terms. And then the family moved to Tampa. Many early Florida mayors were Jewish, as they were respected, trusted, good speakers, and considered highly educated. The city of Miami has only had one Jewish mayor, which I found totally remarkable. Abe Aronovitz was raised in Key West. In fact, you saw a picture of his family store when I showed the Jew stores in the early part of my presentation. You saw his family store in Key West. He was one of 10 sons of Kate and Dave Aronovitz. He settled in Miami in 1922, and after serving in World War II, he went into law practice. Aronovitz was acting as the state attorney and Miami city attorney in both of those positions in the 1930s. As Miami's 27th mayor, he battled anti-Semitism, the police department, and slums, and forced Florida Power and Light to cut rates. Imagine that. In November of 2020, just several months ago, after my book was released, Daniela Levine Cava was elected the mayor of Miami-Dade County, their first woman mayor and the first Jewish mayor of Miami-Dade County. Actually, she's only the second Jewish mayor of a county in the entire state. And I was able to find two Jewish mayors in your community of North Miami Beach, Arthur Snyder, who served in the 1960s, and Myron Rosner, who served from 2009 to 2012. Having only one Jewish mayor in Miami is in contrast to Miami Beach, which has had 17 Jewish mayors since Mitchell Wolfson, and the current mayor is Dan Gelber since 2017. In Miami in 1925, Mitchell Wolfson founded a movie theater chain called Wametco, which stood for Wolfson Meyer Theater Company. Sidney Meyer was his brother-in-law. He had married Mitchell's sister, Xenia. In 1943, Wolfson served as the mayor of Miami Beach, but he resigned very shortly to serve in World War II because he had to, quote, go fight the Nazis. And then in 1949, he and Sidney Meyer started Florida's first television station in their first Wametco theater, which is shown on the right. It was the nation's 16th TV station, WTVJ. Wolfson controlled Wametco until his death in 1982. It became a giant entertainment and leisure time conglomerate that was sold by the family for nearly $1 billion in 1983, the largest corporate sale in the history of South Florida at that time. Florida's had one Jewish governor, Daytona's Governor David Schultz. He was inaugurated in 1933. This photo was taken on February the 15th, 1933. This is a very historical photograph. I collected it because it was showing David Schultz in the center as our Jewish governor. But it was the day of the assassination attempt of President-elect Franklin Roosevelt. If you notice, I said it was February and he was president-elect because at that time, presidents were not inaugurated until March. That January inauguration didn't start till 1937. So on the right, if there's anyone on the Zoom from Chicago, you might recognize Mayor Anton Cermak. Cermak was shot and was fatally shot by the assassination attempt. And the person that shot the bullet was Giuseppe Zangara, who was convicted in murder and electrocuted in 1 month. I found that astounding. David Schultz served 4 years as governor. He was a dynamic public speaker. He took the reins of state governor when the worst effects of the Depression were being felt in Florida. He paid the bills, distributed free school books, gave more money to schools, and started commissions to serve the public good. We've had nearly 300 Jewish judges to the present. 5 Jews have served on Florida's Supreme Court. All served as Chief Justice, except Robert Luck of Miami, who last year was appointed to the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. There is such a variety of stories in my book, like this 1966 U.S. postage stamp, the first of a living person. Lou Jacob of Sarasota was a master clown who performed for Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for 60 years, from 1925 to 1985, and was a founder of the Clown College. Or a ghost story connected with the death of Simon Feinberg in his hotel that was built in 1861 in Cedar Key. It is a Florida Heritage Historical Site and was the subject of its own TV special. In the 1980s, as I gathered photos, I developed a slideshow, as I mentioned, and I continued to speak around the state. These treks were very productive in collecting more stuff and making interesting connections. This is a typical German Jewish family, the Gundersheimers, arriving in Milton, Florida, which is in North Florida, 15 years before the Civil War. I showed this photo again in Sarasota, and I learned 2 women, this was amazing. I showed the slide, and 2 women on opposite sides of the rooms went up to the screen and said, "That woman is my grandmother." And that was Anna, shown in the circle. These 2 women didn't even know they were related. And then I learned that Anna had married a Russian Jew, Jacob Barker. Their son, Bernard Barker, lived in Cuba. He got married, and in 1917, they had Bernard Barker Jr. I kept mulling that name around in my head because it had sounded familiar. Does anyone recognize the name Bernard Barker Jr.? Well, he was the plumber in the Watergate break-in at the Democratic headquarters in 1972. Ann Shops, who had been on my committee in Pensacola, saw her cousin come into the temple one Shabbat when prisoners from Eglin Federal Prison attended. Born in Cuba, he had moved to Miami in 1960 and first been recruited by E. Howard Hunt as an undercover operative in the CIA directed plots to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. And then he was recruited for Watergate. After prison, he worked as a building inspector for the city of Miami. He died in 2009. Descendants are still in Pensacola, and yes, they're still Jewish. I always get asked that. Some Florida Jews are famous, and some are infamous, like Meyer Lansky, whose career was crime, but the government could never convict him. Known as the mob's accountant, he was a member of Beth Jacobs Synagogue that is now the Jewish Museum of Florida, and there was actually a stained glass window dedicated to him there. Here, in this photograph, he was called the chairman of the board. He's shown with his sons, Paul and Buddy, in Miami Beach in 1942. He had a home on Miami Beach since the 1930s when he began his gambling there. I wrote a lot about him in the book because there seems to be a fascination with mobsters. He died at Mount Sinai Hospital on Miami Beach in 1983 at age 81. Shown here is his window and the ticket for synagogue services in 1978. I get asked about his sons, if they went into the family business. No, they did not. Actually, Buddy, who's shown on the right here, had cerebral palsy, and he died in 1989. Paul actually went to West Point, and in 1962, he was sent by President Kennedy to Vietnam as an advisor. He also worked for NASA's Apollo space program. There's also a daughter, Sandra, who wrote a book about her dad, who had been an immigrant from Russia. An example of an inspirational immigrant story is Shepard Broad, also from Russia. He was presented the Horatio Alger Award in 1979. Born in Pinsk in the ghetto in 1906, Shepard was orphaned at the age of 10. In 1920, an uncle in New York sent him a boat ticket, and by the time he got to the dock in Belgium, he had missed the boat. He went to Montreal, and because he was so sickly, he was nearly returned to Pinsk. But Adolf Stark, shown on the left with Shepard when he arrived, rescued him. And I understand there's a great-granddaughter, Lori Wyman is on the Zoom, is actually a great-granddaughter of this Adolf Stark. Adolf Stark rescued him, as I said, and took him to his uncle in New York. He was put in the 3rd grade because he only spoke Yiddish. 7 years later, at age 20, he graduated from New York Law School. Broad said, and I spent several days interviewing him, and one of the interest, he said he was probably the most brilliant person I interviewed. And one of the things he said is, when you have no money and nothing except a rather decent head on your shoulders, the thing to do is use your head, end quote. And with that head, he settled on Miami Beach in 1940 with his wife, Ruth, and children, Ann, Bustle, and Morris. He developed Bay Harbor Islands, where he was a mayor for 30 years, from 1947 to 1973. He built the Broad Causeway, partnered with Alvin Cassell for the law firm, started banks, and was the most avid Zionist in all of Florida. He secured 3 boats, which one of them is shown in the lower right, to send from Miami to Europe to rescue Jews from the displaced persons, DP camps, after World War II, boats like the Exodus, that same movement. It was called the Aliyah Bet movement. He was a remarkable man, remarkable story. He told me stories about his battles with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has risen globally by 18% in the past year. In my book, I used the word anti-Semitism more than 50 times because this was the driving force that propelled Jews to move from place to place over history. I discussed the dark side of the Jewish experience in Florida. Anti-Semitism historically occurs in eras of great change, where people are feeling very anxious and threatened by technological, economic and industrial change, and pandemics, going back to the time of medieval blood libels and plagues in Europe. And again, the Jews are blamed. We've seen a tsunami of anti-Semitic hatred on the internet and social media that baselessly blames Jews for having invented the coronavirus, for intentionally spreading it, profiting from it, or using it as a tool for global control. Often Jews escaping persecution in Europe faced anti-Semitism again when they settled in Florida, like this early case of Samuel Fleischman, who was murdered for giving credit to freed slaves in 1869. Today, Florida has the second largest number of hate groups in the entire nation, 67 hate groups. In fact, Stormfront, the world's first website devoted to the agenda of hatred in cyberspace, was launched in 1995 in West Palm Beach, Florida. These kinds of discriminatory signs were seen all over. These were on Miami Beach, and they were all over the state until a state law made them illegal in 1949. Not until 1949. My book is a vehicle for discussions. Young Jews who grow up in Florida and all those who choose to make Florida home have this knowledge of what Jews before them experienced and actions they took to improve the lives of Jews here today. Both of these images are from the late 1930s in Miami. Jews organized, overcame the discrimination, and were successful in businesses. Knowledge of the ginormous contributions in every area of the development and success in Florida strengthens Jewish identity and provides information and tools to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism. As I said, my book is one tool because it presents the evidence. I grew up during the age of Hitler and the Holocaust, when Jews followed the Shah Shtil philosophy of hush, don't brag or speak about what Jews accomplished. They thought this would quell the hatred. Well, that didn't work, did it? Jews had been hated for 2,000 years. There is a parallel between the ancient forces of xenophobia that drove Jews out of 109 countries, that prevented them from residing in Florida for 250 years after settlement began, even from some Florida cities in modern history, and what is happening today. We know about the hotel restrictions on Miami Beach in the 1947 movie Gentleman's Agreement. There were the same restrictions around the state. The top photograph shows the Hotel Relum, which opened for Jews on Paso Grill Beach, which is part of the beach where I live, in response to restrictive policies, because Jews could not check into any hotels. The lower photo is the Blackstone Hotel. In 1928, while on vacation on Miami Beach, Nathan Stone was unable to obtain a room because of anti-Semitic policies. Stone purchased land at Washington and 8th Street and built a hotel that welcomed Jews and Blacks. In 1977, Richard Stone, grandson of Nathan Stone and Florida's second U.S. Jewish senator, presented to Herman Edelstein the Silver Star, the U.S. Armed Forces' third highest military decoration for valor in combat. But the key to knowing the story is that he didn't get this until 60 years after he earned it, because his honor was denied due to an anti-Semitic Army commanding officer. Jews will continue to act for what is right for our people, our communities, and our world. Even though Jews are less than 1/4 of 1% of the world's population, Jews have been awarded 22% of all Nobel Prizes, and 2 of those Nobels have been awarded to Floridian Jews. Marshall Nierenberg of Orlando, and a 1948 graduate of the University of Florida, received the 1968 Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology for interpretation of the genetic code and its function in protein synthesis. He died in 2010, and his wife donated his papers to the Jewish Museum of Florida. And on the right, you recognize Isaac Bashevis Singer of Miami Beach, receiving the Nobel Prize in 1978 in literature. We remain minute in number, but mighty in our contributions to humanity. Jews are like cut flowers. We die without roots. These stories of our collective historic memories are our roots. I've shared much less than 1% of the stories I gathered in my 35 years of research, and about 8% of what is in the book. What I learned is that history is people. people who effect change, who make the world a better place, people who inspire. History helps us understand our society. Our memories of history are what define us. We need to hear the stories, preserve them, and pass them down to those who follow us. The stories of people inspire us to take action in our own lives. The book about Jews coming to America and to Florida is a long time coming testament to the contributions of Florida Jews and crucial to understanding Florida, American, and American Jewish history. It is about our family. I use the word family more than 500 times in my book, and I hope this gives you a tremendous sense of pride. At this point in my live book talk, I go to the back of the room to sell and sign books. The book is very large, it's heavy, it's almost 5 pounds. It's 434 pages with 716 photographs. And in addition, if you want to consider one to buy one for yourself, maybe for your children and also your grandchildren, you can order one by emailing me right there at mzerivitz@me.com. And like the show Hamilton ends with the line, "America, you are an unfinished symphony." The story of the Florida Jewish experience continues. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.
Again, Marcia, I wanted to thank you. This has been brought to you by the City of North Miami Beach Library. We are so glad that you were able to join us and present your book to us.